In 1903, a man who had never once lived in Panama signed away Panama's future. He wasn't Panamanian. He wasn't a president. He wasn't even a diplomat by profession. He was a French engineer with no country left to serve, because the company he'd worked for had already collapsed into bankruptcy years earlier. So how does a broke foreign engineer end up deciding the borders of a brand new nation? The weapon he used wasn't an army. It wasn't a fortune either. It was a postage stamp. Just a small, printed piece of paper worth a few cents. And with it, he helped redraw the map of an entire hemisphere. This is the story of how one man's obsession built the most important shortcut on Earth. It's also the story of how that obsession cost tens of thousands of lives. How it manufactured a country in the space of a single afternoon. And how, right now, in 2026, the very same 50 miles of jungle is once again the center of a fight between global superpowers. Stick with me through this one, because by the end of it, you will never look at a shipping route on a map the same way again. Every canal has a current running through it. This one has always run on ambition, disease, and betrayal. Let's go back to the very beginning, to the man who first laid eyes on this strip of land and had no idea what he'd just discovered. Before we get there, sit with this for a second. Every single person in this story believed completely that they were the one who would finally solve Panama. Kings, diplomats, presidents, engineers. Every one of them was eventually humbled by 50 miles of jungle. Except one man who didn't try to defeat the jungle at all. He simply learned how to manipulate the people around it instead. Keep that thought in mind as we move forward, because it explains everything that's about to happen. We're going to cover 400 years of history in this video. Spanish kings, Scottish colonists, French diplomats, American presidents, Colombian generals, and eventually, Chinese port developers. But underneath all of it, this is really the story of one narrow strip of land, and everyone who ever believed they could bend it to their will. Some paid with their fortunes. Thousands paid with their lives. And one man walked away with almost everything without ever picking up a shovel himself. If that sounds like the plot of a heist film, that's because, in a very real sense, it is one. Except nobody stole a painting or a vault of gold. They stole geography itself. Let's begin where every good heist story should, with the target, sitting in plain sight for 400 years before anyone figured out how to actually take it. Picture a map of the Americas stretched out in front of you. Now picture two oceans, the Atlantic to the east, the Pacific to the west, separated at one single point by barely 50 miles of solid land. 50 miles. That's the entire gap. For centuries, that thin strip didn't matter to anyone, because it happened to be one of the most brutal, disease-choked, mountainous stretches of jungle anywhere on the planet. Ships trying to move cargo, soldiers, or settlers from one ocean to the other simply couldn't cross it. Instead, they sailed the long way around, all the way down to the southern tip of South America, past Cape Horn, one of the most violent, unforgiving stretches of open water in the world. That detour alone could add months to a single voyage. Storms, freezing temperatures, and shipwrecks weren't rare exceptions on that route. They were simply the price of doing business between the two great oceans. Sailors had a grim nickname for the passage around Cape Horn. They called it the Sailor's Graveyard, because so few ships that attempted it in bad weather ever made it through intact. Cargo, letters, entire crews, all lost to a stretch of ocean that most ships had no choice but to cross. Merchants and governments alike understood, even in the 1500s, that whoever found a way around this problem would hold an extraordinary advantage over everyone else. Then, in 1513, everything changed, almost by accident. A Spanish explorer named Vasco Núñez de Balboa was cutting through the Panamanian jungle with a small expedition, chasing local rumors of gold hidden somewhere beyond the mountains. Days of swamp, days of steep, unmapped mountain trails, days of insects, heat, and disease that had already claimed several of his men. And then, almost without warning, the jungle opened up, and he found himself standing on a strip of land so narrow he could see water on both sides at once. To his left, the Atlantic. To his right, an ocean no European had ever laid eyes on before. He named it the Pacific and claimed it, along with every shore it touched, for the Spanish crown. He waded into the water himself, sword raised, and declared it Spanish territory in front of his stunned men. It's a moment that gets romanticized in old paintings and history books, a lone explorer claiming an ocean. What those paintings rarely show is that Balboa's expedition had been guided there by local chiefs, some cooperating willingly, others under threat of violence. The discovery being celebrated back in Spain was, for the people already living there, simply Tuesday. But the real significance of what he'd found wasn't the ocean itself. It was the distance between the two oceans. Word of Balboa's discovery raced back to Spain, and it planted an idea that would refuse to die for the next 400 years. If you could cut a channel through this narrow strip of land, you could shrink a journey of thousands of kilometers into almost nothing. Spain's King Charles V took the idea seriously enough to send engineers to survey the land in person. Their answer came back fast, and it wasn't encouraging. Impossible, they said. The terrain was mountainous and rocky in some places, swampy and unstable in others, blanketed by dense jungle everywhere, and the engineering tools of the 16th century simply weren't capable of handling any of it. One survey report reportedly warned the king that attempting to cut through the isthmus would cost more lives and gold than any war Spain had ever fought, a warning that turned out, centuries later, to be remarkably accurate. So Spain shelved the dream, and for a while, the idea of a canal through Panama went quiet. There's a detail most versions of this story leave out completely. Balboa never would have found that narrow strip of land without local guidance. Indigenous communities living in the region had known about the geography of the isthmus for generations, long before any European ship reached these shores. History rarely credits the people who actually knew the land first. It credits the person who claimed it loudest. That pattern of outsiders claiming credit for land other people already understood is going to repeat itself again and again throughout this story. But dreams like this one have a habit of resurfacing exactly when the world needs them most. As global trade expanded over the following 2 centuries, the need for a shortcut between the oceans grew right alongside it. European powers were now reaching deep into Asia, Africa, and the Americas, hauling spices, silver, and slaves back home by the shipload. What every one of them wanted was a faster route, something that could turn a months-long voyage into a matter of weeks. Merchant fleets belonging to the Dutch, the Portuguese, and the French were all quietly studying the same maps, all reaching the same obvious conclusion: that whoever solved Panama first would gain a trading advantage the others simply couldn't match. None of them, however, were willing to commit the resources Spain and Scotland already had, having watched those 2 nations bleed money and lives into the same jungle with nothing to show for it. In 1698, Scotland decided to be the one to try it. A group of Scottish investors launched what became known as the Darien Scheme, an attempt to build a full trading colony on the Panamanian coast, with the long-term goal of controlling a future route between the oceans. It was, almost immediately, a catastrophe. Poor planning, unfamiliar terrain, and diseases the settlers had no defense against tore through the colony within months. Nearly 2,000 Scottish settlers died, and the financial losses were so severe that a huge portion of Scotland's available capital, reportedly close to a fifth of the entire nation's wealth, vanished with the failed venture. It's hard to overstate how significant that loss actually was. Imagine an entire modern nation quietly losing a fifth of its wealth on a single failed colony, and you start to understand why Scotland's leaders were left with almost no alternative afterward. Settlers arrived expecting fertile land and friendly trade partners, based on wildly optimistic reports written by promoters who had never actually set foot in Panama themselves. What they found instead was crushing heat, hostile terrain, and diseases their bodies had no resistance to whatsoever. Ships meant to bring relief supplies from Scotland took months to arrive, and by the time some of them did, there was barely a colony left to resupply. It's rare for a single failed colony to reshape an entire nation's political future, but that's precisely what the Darien Scheme did. The damage to Scotland's economy was so deep that by 1707, the country was forced into the Act of Union with England. Out of that union, Great Britain, as the world would come to know it, was born. Panama had already reshaped the map of the world once, and it hadn't even been dug yet. Britain itself considered the region next, once it had absorbed Scotland's ambitions along with its debts. But after watching what the terrain and the diseases had done to the Darien colonists, British planners kept their distance. Some British officials at the time reportedly joked, darkly, that Panama had already claimed a country the size of Scotland, and Britain had no intention of feeding it another one. For nearly 200 years after that failure, virtually no European power dared touch the idea again. Panama had earned itself a reputation that traveled far beyond its borders, a reputation as a place where ambition, no matter how well funded, went to die. Meanwhile, the ships still sailing the long way around South America kept growing larger, kept carrying more cargo, and kept costing shipping companies more money in wasted time with every passing decade of the industrial age. The pressure to solve Panama wasn't going away, If anything, it was quietly building toward a breaking point. Then, in 1869, the world watched something happen on the other side of the globe that reignited the entire dream almost overnight. It's worth pausing here to really understand what 200 years of failure actually meant. 200 years is longer than the entire history of the United States as a nation. 200 years of engineers, kings, and investors looking at this exact stretch of jungle and quietly deciding it wasn't worth the risk. 200 years is roughly 8 or 9 full human generations, each one inheriting the same unsolved problem, and each one deciding to leave it for the next. Whatever finally cracked this problem open was going to have to be something the world had never tried before. It came from an unexpected direction, a desert on the other side of the planet.
In 1869, France did what almost everyone believed was impossible. Under the direction of a diplomat and entrepreneur named Ferdinand de Lesseps, France completed the Suez Canal in Egypt, cutting nearly 7,000 kilometers off the journey between Europe and Asia. It hadn't been easy either. The Suez project had taken 10 grueling years, faced its own labor disputes, and required de Lesseps to personally convince skeptical investors more than once that the desert could actually be tamed. But it had eventually worked. And that single word, worked, was about to become the most dangerous word in de Lesseps's entire vocabulary. Overnight, de Lesseps became a global celebrity. Crowds gathered in Paris just to catch a glimpse of him, and European monarchs personally invited him to state dinners to hear him describe how he'd tamed the Egyptian desert. Newspapers across Europe started calling him an engineering genius, even though he wasn't, strictly speaking, an engineer at all. He was a career diplomat with an extraordinary talent for raising money and rallying public confidence. Before Suez, de Lesseps had already spent years cultivating relationships with Egyptian rulers, French financiers, and European royalty, building the kind of trust that made his later fundraising almost effortless. He understood something most engineers never bother to learn, that a great project doesn't just need brilliant plans, it needs believers willing to fund it before a single spade of earth is turned. That skill made Suez possible. It would also, a decade later, help talk an entire nation into a catastrophe. And somewhere in the middle of all that praise, de Lesseps started to believe every word of it himself. Success has a strange effect on people. It convinces them that whatever worked once will work again, anywhere, under any conditions, against any obstacle. In 1881, still riding the high of Suez, de Lesseps decided to take on Panama. And this is where one of history's most ambitious engineering projects, and one of its most devastating failures, truly begins. Here is the mistake de Lesseps made, and it turned out to be a fatal one. Egypt was flat, open desert. Panama was steep, unpredictable, mountainous jungle. Egypt barely saw rainfall in an entire year. Panama was drenched in torrential rain for months at a time. And most dangerously of all, Panama, in the late 19th century, was considered a living hell of yellow fever and malaria. diseases nobody yet fully understood the cause of. But nobody wanted to hear caution when the money was already pouring in. Investors across France threw their savings at the project with almost no scrutiny. Nearly 1 million small French investors eventually put money into the venture, an almost unheard-of level of public participation for a single infrastructure project anywhere in the world at the time. Ordinary French citizens, shopkeepers, farmers, retired school teachers, bought up shares in the company building the canal, absolutely convinced that if de Lesseps could build Suez, Panama would be, in his own words, nothing more than child's play. They were about to discover exactly how wrong that confidence really was. It's worth noting how de Lesseps actually sold this project to the public. He held lavish presentations in Paris, complete with maps, models, and confident predictions about how quickly the work would be finished. He rarely, if ever, mentioned the words malaria, yellow fever, or monsoon. Geologists and engineers who had actually visited Panama tried to raise concerns at international engineering congresses. They were largely ignored, dismissed as overly cautious, or simply drowned out by de Lesseps's celebrity and charisma. Confidence, it turns out, is a much better salesman than accuracy. And in this case, that confidence was about to be paid for in human lives. The moment construction actually began, Panama started showing everyone involved its true face. Work crews would spend an entire day blasting and cutting through a mountainside. Then a single night of relentless tropical rain would flood the excavation site with mud and standing water, undoing days of brutal labor in a matter of hours. And then there were the mosquitoes. Small, silent, utterly deadly. Yellow fever and malaria tore through the worker camps at a terrifying speed. And in the 1880s, doctors still didn't understand that mosquitoes were the ones spreading it. Some engineers even placed the legs of hospital beds in small pans of water, believing it would keep disease-carrying insects away, when in reality it was creating the perfect breeding ground right underneath sick patients. It's a small, almost darkly funny detail, except it wasn't funny at all for the patients lying in those beds, unknowingly sleeping inches away from the exact thing that was killing them. But France was in a hurry to finish what it had started, and investor confidence was already beginning to wobble. So sick workers kept working. Exhausted workers kept working. Dying workers kept working, because stopping meant admitting the project might be failing. Over roughly 8 years of construction, close to 20,000 people lost their lives on this project alone. Entire work crews were wiped out within a single season, and hospitals built to hold hundreds were overflowing with thousands. Workers arrived from the Caribbean, from Europe, from all across the French colonial world, drawn by wages that sounded generous back home, and largely unaware of what actually awaited them in the jungle. Letters home slowed, then stopped altogether for entire families, and word eventually spread that Panama wasn't just a difficult posting, it was, for many who went, a one-way trip. Coffin makers in the work camps reportedly couldn't keep up with demand, and some accounts describe bodies being shipped out in barrels normally used for salted meat, simply because there weren't enough proper coffins to go around.
This is the part of the engineering marvel story that rarely makes it into the highlight reel. Meanwhile, back in France, de Lesseps had promised investors the entire canal would cost around 600 million francs. By 1889, the company had already spent well over 1.2 billion francs, more than double the original estimate, and the canal was still nowhere near complete. Panicked investors finally pulled their money out in droves. France's economy took a massive, humiliating hit, and the scandal that followed, involving bribery of French politicians and newspapers paid to stay silent, became one of the largest financial scandals in French history. The project that had started with so much national pride and confidence collapsed entirely, and the company building it was declared bankrupt. It looked, to almost everyone watching, like the Panama Canal was nothing but an impossible dream that had already claimed thousands of lives for absolutely nothing. Small French towns lost entire families of young men who had traveled to Panama hoping to earn enough money to change their futures. Widows across the French countryside received letters informing them their husbands had died of fever thousands of miles from home on a project that would never even be finished. For a decade afterward, the word Panama became, in France, a byword for a national embarrassment and a private tragedy at the same time. There's one more layer to this collapse that rarely makes it into the highlight reel, and it might be the most damning part of the entire French chapter. As the company's finances spiraled out of control, its directors didn't come clean to investors. Instead, they secretly paid bribes to French newspapers to keep publishing glowing coverage of the project, and quietly funneled money to sitting members of the French Parliament to keep regulators from asking too many questions. When the whole scheme finally collapsed and investigators started digging, it turned into one of the largest political corruption scandals in French history, later remembered as the Panama Affair. Several government ministers were implicated. A few politicians took their own lives rather than face the disgrace, and public trust in French financial institutions took years to recover. Ordinary shareholders, the shopkeepers and school teachers who had believed in de Lesseps' promises, were left holding shares that were now worth almost nothing, their life savings gone, along with the men who died digging for a dream that had, in the end, been sold to them dishonestly from the very. So by the time the project reached its lowest point, it wasn't just an engineering failure anymore. It was a symbol of exactly how deep greed and denial could run, from the work camps in the jungle all the way up to the halls of government in Paris. But one man connected to the failed project refused to let it go. His name was Philippe Bunau-Varilla, a senior engineer and major investor on the failed French project, who had spent years working directly on the ground in Panama. Even after the company went bankrupt, even after the world had effectively written Panama off as a cursed graveyard, Bunau-Varilla remained absolutely convinced the canal could still be built. He believed the earlier failure was never really about the geography itself. He believed it came down to arrogance. Specifically, de Lesseps trying to force a flat, sea-level canal, styled after Suez, onto terrain that was never designed to accommodate one. Bunau-Varilla's theory was, on paper, refreshingly simple. Build up and over the mountains, instead of trying to cut straight through them. Use a lock system to lift ships,
rather than fighting the land into submission. It was, in hindsight, almost exactly the design that would eventually be built, years before American engineers officially arrived at the same conclusion themselves. Bunau-Varilla had been right about the actual engineering all along, which made the earlier failures sting even more. But there was a massive, immediate problem standing in his way. France was financially and politically exhausted. Investors who had once thrown money at Panama without a second thought wanted nothing more to do with it. The entire world now saw Panama as a cursed, impossible mission, a graveyard dressed up as an engineering opportunity. Bunau-Varilla spent years after the bankruptcy writing letters, pamphlets, and articles trying to rehabilitate Panama's reputation, largely ignored by a public that had already moved on and written the whole project off as a national embarrassment. He wasn't just fighting geography anymore. He was fighting memory itself, trying to convince the world to forget what it had just watched happen. He self-published detailed technical reports, arguing that the original French survey data was still valid, that the excavation already completed hadn't been wasted, and that a redesigned, lock-based canal could succeed exactly where the sea-level version had failed. Almost nobody in France read them, but a much smaller, much more important audience across the Atlantic eventually would. So Bunau-Varilla did the only thing that made sense to a man who refused to accept defeat. He turned his eyes toward a rising power on the other side of the Atlantic Ocean, the United States of America. And as it happened, America was wrestling with a problem of its own, one that was about to make Bunau-Varilla's pitch land at precisely the right moment in history. It's worth understanding what kind of man Bunau-Varilla actually was, because it matters for everything that follows. He wasn't a career con artist by background. He was, by most accounts, a genuinely skilled engineer who had graduated at the top of his class in Paris and who had spent real years of his life physically present in the jungle, watching colleagues and workers die around him. That's important because it means everything he did next wasn't the work of a stranger gambling with someone else's country. It was the work of a man who had already sacrificed years of his own life to this dream, and who had decided, somewhere along the way, that the end justified almost any means necessary to reach it. That kind of conviction can build extraordinary things. It can also justify almost anything in the process. There's a quote often attributed to Bunau-Varilla that he saw himself not as a lobbyist or a schemer, but as the one man alive who truly understood what Panama could become, if only the rest of the world would get out of his way. Whether or not he phrased it exactly that way, the sentiment tracks perfectly with everything he did over the following 2 years. He didn't see himself as manipulating Panama, Colombia, or the United States. He saw himself as the only person clear-headed enough to finally finish what 4 centuries of failure had left undone. That kind of self-belief is exactly what makes a person capable of rewriting the map of an entire continent, and exactly what makes them dangerous while doing it.
In 1898, the United States fought and decisively won the Spanish-American War, taking control of the Philippines, Guam, and Puerto Rico from a weakened Spanish Empire. On paper, it was a clean, quick victory, but underneath the celebration,
It exposed a serious strategic weakness that American military planners couldn't ignore. During the war, the American battleship USS Oregon was stationed on the Pacific coast and urgently needed to reach the Atlantic to help reinforce the fleet. There was no shortcut available anywhere on the map. It had to sail the entire length of South America, past Cape Horn, through some of the most dangerous ice-cold waters on the continent. That single journey took 66 days from start to finish. 66 days for one warship to reach a conflict where it was desperately needed. American newspapers tracked the Oregon's progress almost daily, and public anxiety grew with every week that passed without the ship reaching its destination. By the time it finally arrived, the war was nearly over, and the ship's own crew had become a national symbol of just how vulnerable America's two coastlines really were, cut off from each other by an entire continent. For American military strategists, especially naval theorists like Alfred Thayer Mahan, this was a genuinely frightening wake-up call. Mahan had spent years arguing, in books that were being read in naval academies across the world, that the nations who controlled the sea would control the century ahead. A country that couldn't move its own navy between its own two coastlines in under 2 months, he argued, had no real claim to being a serious global power at all. If a real, larger-scale war broke out, and rapid naval deployment between the oceans was ever required again, 66 days could easily be the difference between victory and disaster. Suddenly, a canal wasn't just a matter of commercial convenience anymore. It had become, in the eyes of Washington, a matter of national security. But here's the twist that most people get wrong when they retell this story. America's first choice for a canal wasn't Panama at all. It was Nicaragua. Even President Theodore Roosevelt, who would later become one of the canal's fiercest champions, initially leaned toward the Nicaragua route himself, based on the technical reports his own commission had produced. Nicaragua's terrain was considered easier to dig through. The disease risk was thought to be lower, and Panama, at the time, wasn't even its own country. It was still a distant, restless province of Colombia. Nicaragua had one more advantage that made it especially attractive to American planners. Unlike Panama, it wasn't tangled up in the wreckage of a previous, failed European project, with all the political baggage and bankruptcy scandal that came attached to it. On paper, Nicaragua looked like the clean, uncomplicated choice. And diplomatic relations between Colombia and the United States were, to put it mildly, tense at best. Bruno Varille's entire fortune, his entire life's dream, was about to be erased, because Congress was leaning heavily toward Nicaragua in an upcoming vote. The House of Representatives had already voted decisively in favor of Nicaragua by a margin of more than 200 votes, a result that seemed to almost everyone in Washington like the final word on the matter. But Bruno Varille wasn't a man who accepted defeat quietly or fairly. He was about to play one of the most manipulative, calculated political games in modern diplomatic history. It's worth remembering how close Nicaragua actually came to winning this fight. Momentum in the United States Congress had been building steadily in Nicaragua's favor for months. Bruno Varille had, realistically, only weeks to change the outcome before the decision became effectively final and permanent. Weeks to undo what looked, on paper, like an already settled question. He didn't have an army,
a government, or much money left over after the French collapse. What he had was patience, information, and a complete lack of hesitation about how far he was willing to go. And in the closing days before the vote, all three of those qualities were about to converge into a single, almost comical piece of political theater. A theater involving nothing more dramatic than an envelope, a stamp, and a mailing list of 90 names. Buenos Aires began exactly the way any skilled lobbyist would. He met with senators, businessmen, and policymakers across Washington, arguing repeatedly that the Panama route was shorter and that France had already completed a huge portion of the necessary excavation. Money and time saved, he told them again and again. He also quietly negotiated the remaining French assets down to a fraction of their original value, $40 million instead of the more than $100 million originally demanded, specifically to make the Panama option look financially irresistible next to Nicaragua. Every argument he made was carefully engineered to make the math, not just the geography, favor his chosen route. For a while, it simply wasn't enough. Nicaragua still had the political momentum, and most of Congress seemed ready to vote that way. Then, in May of 1902, nature handed Buenos Aires an opening he could never have planned for himself. Mount Pelée, a volcano on the Caribbean island of Martinique, erupted with almost no warning, killing close to 30,000 people in a matter of minutes. The entire world was in shock, and newspapers everywhere carried horrifying accounts of an entire city wiped off the map. Buenos Aires, without hesitation, saw an opportunity buried inside a genuine human tragedy. He began telling American senators, quietly and repeatedly, that Nicaragua was also surrounded by active volcanoes. He found an unexpected ally in this final push, too, a wealthy American lawyer with his own financial stake in the Panama route, who used his personal connections in the Senate to reinforce the same volcano warnings Buenos Aires was pushing from the outside. Then he did something almost absurdly simple and devastatingly effective at the same time. He tracked down an old Nicaraguan postage stamp, still in circulation. Printed right on it, a volcano smoking ominously in the background of the design. He purchased dozens of copies of that exact stamp and personally mailed one to every single sitting United States senator, just days before the final vote on the canal route. He didn't stop at 90 senators either. Some accounts describe him scrambling through stamp dealers across Washington and Paris, trying to find enough copies in time, worried that a shortage would blow his entire plan at the last minute. The message needed no accompanying letter, no explanation at all. The stamp said everything on its own. This is what you are choosing, if you choose Nicaragua. It was misleading in the extreme, technically accurate in the smallest sense, but wildly, deliberately exaggerated in its implication. And it worked, almost immediately. In the days leading up to the vote, senators who had been firmly leaning toward Nicaragua abruptly flipped their position toward Panama instead. A single postage stamp, worth a few cents, had just helped decide where one of the most important pieces of infrastructure in modern history would ultimately be built. But convincing America to choose Panama solved only half of Buenos Aires' problem. Panama still legally, formally, belonged to Colombia, and Colombia had already flatly refused to allow a canal on its territory. Take a moment to appreciate what actually just happened in this chapter. A vote involving one of the largest infrastructure decisions in American history was swayed, in its final days, by a piece of mail costing a few cents. Not a battleship, not a formal treaty, not even a direct bribe. A stamp. It remains one of the clearest examples in modern history of how perception, rather than fact, can decide outcomes that shape the world for generations afterward. And Buenos Aires was only just getting started.
This is the point where the story stops being about engineering entirely and becomes something far more unsettling. Buenos Aires couldn't simply buy Colombia's permission, no matter how much money or pressure he applied. So instead, he decided to remove Colombia from the equation completely by quietly helping to invent a brand new country to negotiate with in its place. For years, through his time working on the French project, he had built close relationships with Panamanian separatists, local leaders who had wanted full independence from Colombia for decades, and who had already attempted several small uprisings before, only to be crushed by the Colombian military every single time. This time, Buenos Aires assured them, things would go differently. He personally funded the rebel movement. He helped design their new national flag. It's a detail that still surprises people today. Panama's national flag, one of the most recognizable symbols of the country's sovereignty, was partly the creative work of a Frenchman who had never lived there, sketched out with input from local allies, but funded and coordinated from Buenos Aires' own pocket. He even helped draft a working constitution for a country that, at that exact moment, did not legally exist anywhere in the world. He reportedly worked out of a hotel suite in New York, coordinating with rebel contacts by coded telegram, treating the founding of an entire nation like a business transaction being finalized between two consenting parties. In exchange for all of this, he asked for exactly one thing in return. When Panama finally became independent, he would be named its official ambassador to the United States. A Frenchman, representing a Latin American nation he had never held citizenship in. Remarkably, almost unbelievably, the Panamanian rebel leaders agreed to his terms. Some historians believe they simply had no better option left after decades of failed uprisings crushed by Colombian troops. A foreign ambassador with money, connections, and a direct line to Washington was, to them, worth more than a native Panamanian with none of those advantages. On the other side of the arrangement, Buenos Aires convinced Washington that if American naval forces simply blocked Colombian troops from physically reaching Panama, the revolution would succeed entirely on its own, and the canal's legal path would finally be clear, permanently. On November 2, 1903, the American warship USS Nashville quietly arrived off the Panamanian coast, officially citing an old 1846 treaty that obligated the United States to protect free transit through the isthmus. The very next day, November 3rd, the long-planned revolution formally began in Panama City. When Colombian troops arrived by sea to crush the uprising, exactly as they had every single time before, American forces moved to block the only railway line connecting the coast to the interior. Colombian officers reportedly stepped off their ship expecting a routine deployment, only to discover the railway conveniently unavailable and no other practical way to march an army through 50 miles of dense jungle in time. It was, in effect, a war decided entirely by logistics rather than combat. Colombian soldiers never even made it to the capital. The entire revolution lasted a single day, almost without a shot fired. By most accounts, the only reported casualty of the entire uprising was a shopkeeper, killed not by rebels or American forces, but by a stray shell fired from a Colombian gunboat still anchored offshore, uncertain what was even happening onshore. An entire nation was born, and the death toll of its founding revolution numbered exactly 1, an almost unbelievable statistic for the birth of a country. Just 3 days later, on November 6, 1903, the United States officially recognized Panama as a fully independent, sovereign nation. Panama, in other words, did not fight its way to freedom in any traditional sense. It was handed freedom, on a timeline that suited someone else's canal plans far more than it suited Panama's own readiness for statehood. Think about the sheer speed of what just happened here. A nation that had existed as a province for nearly 400 years became independent, was recognized by the world's rising superpower, and had its future effectively decided, all within a single week. Most countries fight for generations to achieve what Panama received in 7 days. But independence that arrives that quickly, and that conveniently, always comes with strings attached. And those strings were about to be written into a document Panama's own leaders hadn't even been allowed to read first. Now here is the part of this entire story that still makes historians visibly uncomfortable, more than a century later. Just 2 weeks after Panama's newly declared independence, Buenos Varia, acting as Panama's self-appointed ambassador, sat down directly with the United States Secretary of State to negotiate a formal treaty on Panama's behalf. He did not wait for any instructions from Panama's brand-new, barely formed government. He did not send the proposed terms back to Panama City for review or approval first. He understood with total clarity that if actual Panamanian leaders saw the fine print before it was signed, they would almost certainly object to it. So he signed the treaty first, and informed Panama's government only afterward. The terms of the Hay-Buenos Varia Treaty, formally signed on November 18, 1903, were nothing short of staggering. The United States received permanent, perpetual control of a 10-mile-wide canal zone, cutting directly through the heart of the brand-new nation, effectively forever. In exchange, Panama received a one-time payment of $10 million and a modest annual rent beginning in 1912. To put that number in perspective, the United States had already spent $40 million simply buying out France's old equipment and assets. 4 times what it was paying Panama for permanent control over sovereign land running through the heart of the country. The math alone tells you who this treaty was actually designed to benefit. The United States also secured the unilateral right to intervene militarily inside the zone whenever it deemed necessary, along with the right to acquire additional Panamanian land during construction, without needing further approval. A man with no Panamanian ancestry, no formal mandate from Panama's citizens, and an enormous personal financial stake in the outcome, had just permanently signed away a slice of sovereign territory belonging to a country he did not legally belong to himself. That is not diplomacy in any conventional sense of the word. It's closer to a private business deal, dressed up in the language of nations and treaties, negotiated by a man answerable to no one but himself. That is one of the most audacious geopolitical maneuvers of the entire 20th century, and it succeeded exactly as it had been designed to. As part of the same arrangement, the United States also purchased France's remaining assets and equipment in Panama for $40 million, a payout that directly included Buenos Varia's own personal investment in the failed original project. He did not simply get his canal built, after all. He got personally paid for making it happen. Colombia protested furiously through every diplomatic channel available to it, accusing the United States outright of stealing sovereign territory through manufactured revolution. But there was, in practice, absolutely nothing Colombia could do to reverse it. Colombia spent the next 2 decades pursuing formal apologies and compensation from Washington, and the wound never fully healed. It wasn't until 1921, 18 years after the fact, that the United States finally agreed to pay Colombia $25 million in what was widely understood as quiet compensation for the loss of Panama, though Washington never officially framed it that way. Some historians believe that payment only happened at all because American oil companies were suddenly very interested in gaining access to Colombian oil fields, and a peace offering made those negotiations easier. The deal was final, the treaty was binding, and now, after 400 years of failed attempts by other nations, the real construction could finally begin. It's worth sitting with the irony of this moment before moving forward. 4 centuries of kings, companies, and empires had tried and failed to build this canal. It took a bankrupt engineer with no legal standing in Panama, working almost entirely outside official channels, to finally clear every political obstacle in a matter of weeks. The engineering problem hadn't been solved yet. But the much harder problem, the political one, had just been solved through sheer audacity. Now, for the first time in the story, actual construction, real machines and real workers could finally take over. America was determined from the very first day not to repeat any of France's earlier mistakes. And remarkably, the first mistake they chose to address wasn't engineering at all. It was disease control. Before a single new shovel touched the ground under American management, a physician named William Gorgas was placed in charge of an enormous, systematic mosquito eradication campaign across the entire canal zone. Gorgas had already fought yellow fever in Cuba, where doctors had recently proven, against enormous skepticism, that mosquitoes, rather than dirty air or bad hygiene, were spreading the disease. Many American officials initially dismissed his methods as an expensive waste of time and money, unwilling to believe that something as small as an insect could be behind a plague that had defeated France's finest engineers. Gorgas persisted anyway, and history eventually proved him right. Standing water anywhere near the work camps was identified and drained. Fumigation crews swept through entire towns, spraying insecticide and clearing breeding grounds street by street. Workers were given screened housing, mosquito netting, and consistent medical oversight for the first time in the project's history. Within a remarkably short window, yellow fever was virtually eliminated from the canal zone, and malaria rates dropped dramatically. The diseases that had quietly killed thousands of workers during the earlier French effort were, for the first time in 4 centuries, actually brought under real control. The second major decision America made was, in the long run, just as important. French engineers had insisted, stubbornly, on building a sea-level canal, a straight, uninterrupted cut styled directly after the success of Suez. American engineers studied the land far more carefully and reached a fundamentally different conclusion. Panama's terrain simply would not allow for that kind of design, no matter how much dynamite or manpower was thrown at it. Both oceans sat at sea level, yes, but the land directly in between rose to roughly 85 feet above it through solid rock and unstable mountain terrain. So instead of forcing an impossibly straight line directly through a mountain range, American engineers, led by figures like John Stevens and later George Goethals, designed something considerably more clever. Stevens in particular is often overlooked in this story, despite reorganizing the entire project's logistics, housing, and railway system before ever ordering a lock to be built. Work that made everything Goethals accomplished afterward possible in the first place. A system of massive locks. To make that system work, they built an enormous artificial lake, Gatun Lake, specifically to supply the volume of water needed to lift and lower ships as they crossed. Here is, in simple terms, how the entire system worked. A ship would enter the canal at sea level from either ocean. It would move directly into the first of several massive concrete chambers. Water from the elevated lake above would then flood into that chamber, gradually lifting the ship along with it, as if riding a rising tide. Each of these chambers was enormous, roughly 1,000 feet long and over 100 feet wide, large enough to comfortably hold some of the biggest ocean liners in the world at the time, with room to spare on either side. The concrete used to build them was mixed and poured on a scale that had never been attempted anywhere in the world before, and engineers had to invent new construction techniques on the spot, simply because nothing on this scale had ever needed to be built. Step by step, chamber by chamber, the ship would rise a full 85 feet until it reached the level of the lake itself. From there, it would sail directly across the lake and a series of connecting channels toward the opposite side of the isthmus. And on the far end, the entire lifting process would run in complete reverse, chamber by chamber, gently lowering the ship back down to sea level, before it finally sailed out into the opposite ocean. It sounds almost too simple to actually work at this scale, and yet it remains, to this very day, more than 100 years later, one of the most elegant engineering solutions ever devised by human beings. What's easy to miss is how much this design decision still shapes global trade today. The size of the original locks quietly defined the maximum size of cargo ships built for nearly a century. An entire class of vessel became known simply as Panamax, engineered specifically to fit through these chambers with only inches to spare. Shipbuilders around the world, from Japan to Germany, designed their largest vessels around this single constraint, a limit set not by physics or economics, but by the width of a lock chamber poured in concrete a century earlier. A decision made in a jungle in the early 1900s was still dictating how shipbuilders designed their vessels almost 100 years later. That's the kind of quiet, lasting influence great engineering leaves behind. It wasn't until Panama itself, now in full control of the canal, completed a massive expansion project in 2016, adding a new set of larger locks, that ships finally outgrew the limits set by engineers working with 1900s technology. Even that expansion, built entirely under Panamanian ownership and paid for through a national referendum, stands as its own quiet symbol of just how far the country had come from the days when it needed no permission at all, because permission had never been asked in the first place. With disease finally under control and a genuinely workable design locked into place, construction picked up real, unstoppable momentum. Somewhere between 40 and 45,000 workers, many of them recruited from the Caribbean, particularly Barbados and Jamaica, labored through the jungle day and night. These West Indian laborers made up the overwhelming majority of the workforce, and they also did the most dangerous, physically punishing jobs, for a fraction of the pay given to white American supervisors overseeing them. The Canal Zone even had a formal, unofficial pay structure, a gold roll for higher-paid American employees, and a silver roll for almost everyone else, mostly black Caribbean laborers. A racial divide that shaped who got housing, medical care, and even which drinking fountains people were allowed to use. Entire mountainsides were blasted apart using dynamite, most dramatically at a notoriously unstable stretch known as the Culebra Cut, where landslides regularly buried weeks of progress in minutes. Workers there sometimes joked grimly that they weren't digging a canal, they were digging the same hole twice, once for the canal, and once more every time the mountain slid back in overnight. Massive steam shovels tore through earth and solid rock around the clock, clearing it out in an endless, grinding stream toward waiting rail cars. What had once been dense, untouched jungle, the same jungle that had defeated Spain, Scotland, Britain, and France in turn, was slowly transforming into the single largest, most ambitious engineering project the modern world had ever attempted. By the time it was finished, workers had excavated roughly 240 million cubic yards of earth and rock, enough material, according to later estimates, to bury an entire small city. Engineers from around the world traveled to Panama specifically to study the project while it was still under construction, hoping to bring lessons back to their own countries. Construction under American management had begun in 1904. The canal was fully completed and opened for traffic in 1914, a full 10 years later, but remarkably, 2 years ahead of the project's original projected schedule. The total cost came to roughly $326 million at the time, a figure worth several billion dollars in today's currency. It remains, to this day, one of the largest single infrastructure investments any government made in the early 20th century, funded almost entirely by American taxpayers
rather than private investors this time around. But money was never truly the real cost of this project, not by a long shot. Around 5,600 workers lost their lives during the American construction phase alone, from accidents, landslides, and the diseases that, despite Gorgas's efforts, never fully disappeared. Add in the deaths from France's earlier disastrous attempt, and the true combined human toll climbs well into the tens of thousands. An entire generation of laborers, largely forgotten by history, buried beneath what the world would go on to celebrate as one of the greatest engineering achievements ever recorded. For decades, there was no formal memorial anywhere along the canal specifically honoring the thousands of West Indian and other laborers whose work had actually made the project possible, an absence that Panamanian historians and descendant communities have spent years trying to correct. The finished canal became a global symbol almost overnight. The graves surrounding it took much, much longer to be remembered at all. In August of 1914, the Panama Canal officially opened to international shipping traffic for the very first time. Fittingly, or perhaps sadly, the opening barely made headlines around the world because it happened in the same month that the First World War broke out across Europe, and every front page was consumed by news of a continent sliding into war instead. A project that had taken 400 years of dreams, 10 years of construction, and tens of thousands of lives to complete, quietly slipped into operation almost unnoticed by the rest of the planet. But this was never simply an engineering victory confined to textbooks about construction. It was a single moment that would go on to reshape the balance of global power for the entire century that followed. 10 years, tens of thousands of workers, thousands of graves, and at the end of it, a single narrow channel of water that changed how the entire planet moved goods, soldiers, and influence from one ocean to another. But the story doesn't end with the ribbon-cutting ceremony. In many ways, the hardest, most uncomfortable chapter of this story was only just beginning. Almost immediately after the canal opened, the effective sailing distance between America's East Coast and West Coast shrank by roughly 13,000 kilometers. American warships could now move between the Atlantic and Pacific fleets in a matter of days, rather than the 66 agonizing days the USS Oregon had once needed. For the first time in the nation's history, the United States could realistically maintain genuine naval dominance across both major oceans at the exact same time. Naval planners who had once worried constantly about splitting their fleet between two coasts could now think of American sea power as a single unified force capable of concentrating anywhere on short notice. The canal didn't just save time. It fundamentally changed how military strength could be projected across the entire planet. The impact on global commercial trade was just as dramatic, if not more so. Shipping routes connecting Europe, Asia, and the Americas shrank considerably almost overnight. Vessels saved enormous amounts of time on every single voyage and saved massive amounts of fuel in the process as well. For agricultural exporters on America's West Coast, the canal meant grain and produce could reach European markets in weeks instead of months, opening up entirely new trading relationships that simply hadn't been economically viable before.
Global trade volume accelerated sharply in the years that followed, and sitting directly at the center of this newly reshaped global network was the United States, controlling the single most valuable choke point on the map. Countries and shipping companies that had built entire business models around the long route past South America suddenly found themselves competing against rivals who could reach the same markets in a fraction of the time. Entire port cities along the old Cape Horn route, once thriving stopover points for exhausted crews and resupplying ships, saw their economies quietly wither as traffic diverted through the new, faster passage. The canal did not simply save time for passing ships. It played a direct, measurable role in cementing America's emergence as a genuine global superpower over the following decades. Historians still debate exactly how much of America's 20th century rise can be traced back to this one canal, but almost none of them argue it played no role at all. But there was a second, far darker side to this entire achievement, one that would take several more decades to fully surface and even longer to properly resolve. Because while the world celebrated a triumph of engineering, the people who actually lived alongside that triumph were quietly becoming strangers inside their own country. A canal built through Panamanian soil, defended by Panamanian silence, run almost entirely for someone else's benefit. That imbalance couldn't stay hidden forever. Under the terms of the Hay-Bunau-Varilla Treaty, the entire 10-mile canal zone legally belonged to the United States in perpetuity, which meant that inside Panama's own recognized borders, there now existed a long, narrow strip of land that looked almost nothing like the rest of the country at all. American flags flying over American schools, American hospitals, American clubhouses, and American-run supermarkets. It resembled, in almost every meaningful sense, a fully functioning American colony, sitting directly in the middle of a supposedly sovereign nation. Zone residents had their own currency privileges, their own postal service, their own court system, and even their own English-language radio and television stations, entirely separate from the Panamanian institutions just a few hundred meters away. Children who grew up inside the zone often described attending schools that looked and felt exactly like schools back in the American Midwest, complete with baseball diamonds and 4th of July parades, while Panamanian children, on the other side of an invisible line, grew up with none of those same resources. And the most painful part of this arrangement was deeply personal for ordinary Panamanians. Panamanian citizens frequently needed a special pass just to enter parts of their own national territory. The best-paying, most desirable jobs inside the canal zone were reserved almost exclusively for American workers and their families. The very country that had been effectively invented to make this canal possible had, over time, become something close to a second-class visitor to its own signature landmark. That quiet resentment simmered beneath the surface for decades, largely ignored by Washington. Panamanian labor unions and student groups organized repeated peaceful protests throughout the 1940s and 1950s, demanding fairer treatment inside the zone. Demonstrations that were consistently met with indifference from American administrators who saw no reason to change an arrangement that worked perfectly well for them. And on January 9, 1964, it finally, violently exploded. A dispute over a Panamanian flag — students were not even legally permitted to raise it inside the canal zone at the time — sparked riots that spread rapidly across the entire country. It started with a small group of Panamanian high school students trying to plant their national flag next to the American one, as a symbolic act, nothing more. A scuffle broke out, the flag was torn, and within hours, that single torn flag had become the spark for a national uprising that had been building for 60 years. American troops were sent in to control the growing unrest, and the resulting violence escalated far beyond anyone's expectations. More than 20 Panamanian citizens, along with several Americans, were killed within just a few hours of chaos. Panama still remembers this day very clearly generations later. They call it Martyrs' Day, and it remains a national holiday of remembrance. The diplomatic backlash was severe and immediate. Panama formally cut diplomatic ties with the United States, and international pressure on Washington began to mount steadily in the years that followed. A country that had spent the entire Cold War presenting itself internationally as the face of democracy now looked, at least inside Panama, uncomfortably like an old-fashioned colonial power. Panamanian leaders, particularly the nationalist military ruler Omar Torrijos, turned the ongoing dispute over the canal into a matter of core national dignity, refusing to let the issue fade quietly. Torrijos reportedly told American negotiators that he would rather see the canal destroyed than continue to see it run entirely by a foreign power, a threat that Washington eventually had to take seriously. He rallied international support from across Latin America and the wider United Nations, framing Panama's fight as a symbol for every nation that had ever had its resources controlled by someone else. After years of tense, drawn-out negotiation, the United States finally relented. In 1977, the Torrijos-Carter treaties were formally signed, setting a firm, non-negotiable date, December 31, 1999, for the United States to hand full and complete control of the canal back to Panama. Ratifying the treaty back home in the United States Senate turned into its own political battle, passing by only a single vote beyond the required two-thirds majority, after a bruising public debate in which opponents accused the administration of simply giving away American property. President Jimmy Carter personally lobbied wavering senators for months, understanding that failure to ratify would leave the conflict with Panama unresolved indefinitely. But even here, in the very moment of concession, America quietly built in a safety net for itself, reserving the explicit right to intervene militarily in the future if it ever judged the canal's neutrality to be genuinely at risk. Even while formally giving the canal back, Washington kept one hand firmly on the door. American involvement in Panamanian internal politics did not stop there either, not by any measure. For years afterward, the United States used Panama's powerful military strongman, Manuel Noriega, as a paid CIA-linked intelligence asset. For a long time, Washington was willing to look past his deepening involvement in drug trafficking and authoritarian rule, simply because he remained useful to American interests in the region. But Noriega gradually grew too powerful, too independent, and far too unpredictable for Washington's comfort. By December of 1989, he had openly declared himself Panama's supreme leader, directly defying the United States government in the process. Washington responded with a full-scale military invasion of Panama that very same month, and Noriega was ultimately forced to surrender to American forces. The invasion itself caused significant civilian casualties in Panama City, and to this day, Panamanian human rights groups continue to push for a full accounting of exactly how many ordinary civilians died during those chaotic days of fighting. Finally, on December 31, 1999, the moment Panama had waited nearly an entire century for, quietly arrived. The American flag came down over the canal zone for the very last time. The Panamanian flag was raised in its place, permanently. It was never simply an administrative handover of property on a piece of paper. It was the long-delayed return of land that had been taken 96 years earlier through deception, manufactured revolution, and outright force. Think about the timeline for a moment. 96 years is longer than most human lifetimes. Generations of Panamanians were born, grew up, worked, and died without ever once having full control over the most important piece of infrastructure inside their own country's borders. Grandparents told grandchildren stories about a canal zone they weren't fully welcome inside. And through all of it, through riots, treaties, invasions, and decades of quiet resentment, Panama never gave up its claim. That persistence is exactly why, when the flag finally changed in 1999, it meant something far deeper than a change in paperwork. Plenty of American voices at the time confidently predicted that Panama would never be able to properly manage such a massive, complex piece of infrastructure on its own. They turned out to be completely wrong. Today, the very canal that once stood as a symbol of American power has become the true economic backbone of the entire Panamanian nation. Toll revenue from ships passing through the canal now funds a significant share of Panama's national budget, paying for schools, hospitals, and infrastructure across the country. A complete reversal of the colonial-style extraction that defined the canal's first 60 years. Roughly 6% of all global maritime trade passes through this single waterway every single year. Thousands of massive cargo ships rely on this narrow, engineered channel to move goods between Asia, the Americas, and Europe. If the canal were ever to shut down suddenly, even briefly, global supply chains would visibly shake. Shipping delays would ripple outward across every ocean, and even global oil prices could spike within days. That is precisely how much quiet power still runs through this one narrow strip of land. And that concentrated power is exactly why an entirely new geopolitical contest has already quietly begun around it. There's another threat to the canal that has nothing to do with politics at all, and everything to do with water. Remember, the entire lock system depends on fresh water from Gatun Lake to lift and lower ships. In 2023 and into 2024, Panama experienced one of the worst droughts in the canal's recorded history. Water levels in the lake dropped so low that canal authorities were forced to drastically cut the number of ships allowed through each day. Shipping companies faced weeks of delay, and some rerouted entirely, adding thousands of kilometers back onto journeys the canal was built to eliminate in the first place. It was a quiet reminder that even the most brilliant engineering solution in the world is still, ultimately, at the mercy of the weather. Panama's government has since invested heavily in new reservoir projects and water-saving basins attached to the locks, trying to make sure a repeat of that drought doesn't paralyze global trade again in the years ahead. Climate scientists warn that as weather patterns grow more unpredictable worldwide, droughts like the one Panama experienced may become more frequent rather than less, adding yet another layer of uncertainty to a waterway the entire planet has quietly come to depend on. Enter China. As China's economy grew explosively over the past 2 decades, its Belt and Road Initiative began funding ports, railways, highways, and other strategic infrastructure projects across the globe, from Africa to South America. Panama eventually landed squarely on Beijing's radar as a natural target for investment. In 2016, a major Chinese logistics company began developing new port infrastructure directly near the canal's entrances. By 2017, Panama formally became the very first Latin American nation to join China's Belt and Road Initiative outright. For Panama, the appeal was simple. Chinese investment came with fewer political conditions attached than American aid traditionally did, and after a century of feeling like a junior partner to Washington, that kind of independence looked attractive. For the United States, watching from a distance, this was an unmistakable alarm bell. The canal remains absolutely critical to the U.S. Navy's global reach and to core American trade routes, even a full century after it was built, and the idea of a rival superpower gaining meaningful influence at its doorstep was considered unacceptable in Washington. In January of 2025, during his first address to Congress after returning to office, the sitting U.S. president made a striking, forceful claim that the canal had been built almost entirely with American money and American lives, that it was never meant to fall under Chinese influence, and that the United States intended to reclaim meaningful control over it in the name of national security. He went further still, floating the idea publicly that the United States could simply take the canal back if Panama didn't act to limit Chinese influence around it, language that startled diplomats across Latin America who hadn't heard an American leader talk about the region in those terms in decades. Just 1 month later, in February of 2025, Panama's own president announced that the country was formally withdrawing from China's Belt and Road Initiative altogether. Chinese-linked port contracts on both ends of the canal were subsequently canceled not long after that announcement. Many independent analysts believe sustained American pressure was directly behind those sudden, dramatic policy reversals in Panama City. More than a century after a single misleading postage stamp helped decide exactly where this canal should even be built in the first place, the same 50 miles of jungle has once again become a bargaining chip between competing global superpowers. And the country that was effectively built specifically to host this canal still doesn't always get the final say over its own future. The Panama Canal was never merely a shortcut carved between 2 oceans. It stands as a lasting monument to how easily the fate of an entire nation can be quietly decided by people who never had to live with the consequences. A postage stamp once changed the outcome of a vote. A signature nobody in Panama saw beforehand gave away sovereign national territory. A flag riot eventually forced a painful reckoning 50 long years later. And in 2026, that very same strip of land is still being quietly fought over by powers thousands of miles away. Panama did not simply build a canal across its own territory. Panama has spent well over a century proving again and again that it actually owns it. And the next chapter of that ongoing fight is still being written right now in real time. So here's the question worth sitting with long after this video ends. How many other borders, treaties, and so-called independent nations around the world today were shaped by a single ambitious individual, a convenient natural disaster, or a piece of misleading propaganda, rather than by the will of the people who actually had to live there? Panama just happens to be one of the rare cases where the paper trail survived clearly enough for us to see exactly how it happened. Somewhere out there, a Frenchman who never held Panamanian citizenship is still, in a strange way, one of the most consequential mapmakers in modern history. He never fired a single weapon. He never commanded a single soldier. All he needed was a postage stamp, a signature, and the absolute certainty that nobody would stop him before it was too late. If you take one thing away from this entire story, let it be this: history rarely turns on the moments we expect. Not always the battles, not always the treaties signed in grand halls with cameras watching. Sometimes it turns on a few cents worth of paper, mailed quietly to the right desks at exactly the right moment, by exactly the right person, willing to risk everything on the bet that nobody would notice until it was already done. Keep that in mind the next time you look at a map and see a border that looks like it's always simply been there. Somewhere behind almost every one of those lines, there's a story just as strange as this one, waiting to be told. That's the story of the Panama Canal. Not just an engineering marvel, a permanent reminder of exactly how power actually moves in this world, quietly, on paper, long before anyone even notices it's happened. Thanks for watching this one all the way through. If this kind of story is your thing, there's plenty more history hiding behind the maps we all take for granted.